October 3rd, 1858, Brazoria County, Texas. Put that date in your mouth like a bitter pill because this is where the record goes quiet on purpose. This is where the men who called themselves patrol, posse, law, and order began to vanish, one after another, without the kind of paperwork that always appears when powerful men die. No inquest that the public could read, no courthouse mourning, no sermons naming the dead, just a clean gap where there should have been noise. And when the system goes silent, it is rarely because nothing happened. It is because something happened that it cannot admit. In the brutal economy of slavery, slave catchers were not a side business. They were enforcement. They were the teeth behind every plantation smile. They were paid to hunt human beings like stray animals, and they did it with the confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. In 1858 Texas, that confidence had a structure. Patrol routes, informants, rewards, and sheriffs who treated violence as administrative work. When a freedom seeker was dragged back, the county did not ask how it was done. The county asked whether the property was returned intact enough to be sold again. That is the moral rot at the center of this story. The law didn't merely tolerate slavery, it protected it like a sacred asset. Now listen carefully because this case begins with a number that the official story refuses to hold steady. 37. 37 slave catchers. Armed men, organized men, gone within 11 nights. The count changes depending on who is speaking, which is always a sign of a cover-up. When a society cannot agree how many hunters disappeared, it is not confusion, it is management. Someone is controlling what gets said aloud and what stays trapped in whispers. And then there is the name the county treated like a stain, Mare Whitcomb. Not famous, not recorded like a person, recorded like a tool. In plantation notes, she was laundress, seamstress, quiet. Age about 24. That phrase, about, tells you everything. The enslaved were measured as bodies, not lives. Their birthdays did not matter. Their marriages did not matter. Their grief did not matter. The system wanted a woman without a timeline, because timelines create personhood, and personhood creates accountability. Kestrel Bend Plantation, outside Columbia, Texas, sat near water and roads that mattered, places where patrols moved, where goods moved, where people were traded like meat. It was close enough to town to be watched, and far enough to be lawless in practice. That distance is where cruelty thrives, near civilization's language, far from civilization's restraint. The courthouse ledger in Brazoria County will tell you that patrol rosters existed, names, dates, signatures, administration. But it will not tell you the truth that the enslaved always knew. These rosters were weapons lists. They were inventories of men authorized to terrorize. In late September 1858, there were rumors, whispers that moved faster than horsemen. Not rumors of freedom, rumors of retaliation. Patrollers complained about nerves, about unease, about a woman's foolishness that made them laugh and then, somehow, made them angry. That last part matters. Oppressors get angry when their control is mocked, especially by someone they have categorized as weak. They can tolerate rebellion better than they can tolerate disrespect. Mara was dismissed in the language of the time. Slow, simple, girl, not woman, not strategist, not mind. The men who hunted human beings built their confidence on that dismissal. They needed the enslaved to be smaller in their imagination than they were in reality. That is how you justify what you do every day without vomiting from shame. You convince yourself the victim is less than you. You call her foolish. You call her harmless. And then you stop seeing her. But the disappearances began anyway. October 3rd. First night. The early patrols that week followed a predictable rhythm. 2 men here, 3 men there, moving along creek lines and dirt roads where escape was most likely. They bragged about being organized. They weren't. They were repetitive. Repetition is where intelligence goes to work. You don't need to outgun a man if you can outthink his habits. That first night, a man named Calder Rusk, mid-30s, known for drinking, known for cruelty that never made it into the record, failed to return from a sweep near Oyster Creek in another kind of county, another kind of system that would have triggered an immediate public response. But in Brazoria County, 1858, public response created risk. Public attention invited questions. Questions invited blame. So they handled it privately, like thieves handling a problem inside their own gang. By morning, there was searching. What was found was not a body. It was evidence arranged like an accusation. A lantern dropped, a strap torn, boot prints in mud that led nowhere sensible. You should understand what that implies. Either Rusk vanished into thin air, which is fantasy, or someone wanted the searchers to waste time, to chase emptiness, to follow a trail designed to die. This is the moment the story stops being about one missing patrolman and starts becoming a case file the county refused to open. Because when the first hunter vanished and the system did not alert the public, it made a decision. Protect the institution, not the truth. And somewhere close to all of this, inside the daily grind that enslaved women were forced to perform, Mara continued to work. Laundering, sewing, listening. That's the other dirty secret of slavery. It required proximity. Enslaved women were placed close enough to overhear plans, to see weapons, to learn patterns, close enough to be exploited, close enough to observe. The men thought proximity meant control. They forgot proximity also means access. The official accounts never say Mara planned it. They never say Mara led them. They don't want to give that credit because credit would make her dangerous in memory. They prefer superstition. They prefer accident. They prefer to call it panic and unrest and unknown agitators. Notice how that language works. It removes the human mind from the event. It turns strategy into fog. But even fog has a source. By October 3rd, 1858, the county had the motive to lie. Slave catchers were not merely men. They were an arm of the economy. If 37 of them were eliminated, whether killed, trapped, driven off, or simply disappeared, the implication is catastrophic. The enslaved were not passive. The enslaved were not helpless. The enslaved were capable of coordinated resistance. And if that truth became common knowledge, the entire social order would shake. Plantations would panic. Merchants would hesitate. Sheriffs would look weak. And weakness in a culture built on domination is intolerable. So what did they do? They minimized. They obscured. They reduced the story to whispers and blamed it on trouble. And they took the one person they could not allow to become a symbol, Mara Whitcomb, and erased her the way the system always did, by refusing to write her as a person with agency. Here is the moral responsibility we inherit. We do not get to accept that erasure is final. The fact that a record is quiet does not mean the event was small. It means someone with power demanded silence. And when you hear "foolish trick" attached to an enslaved woman in Texas, 1858, you should translate it correctly. They are telling you she outsmarted them, and they are trying to make her intelligence sound like a joke. Remember the date. October 3rd, 1858. 11 nights begin there. 37 hunters, 1 county, and 1 woman, the system described as nothing more than labor. If you've ever wondered how evil survives, it survives through paperwork, through omissions, through polite language. This story is not about mystery, it is about exposure. And the first exposure is simple. When the hunters started disappearing, the county didn't ask who deserved justice. It asked what truth needed to be buried. If you're listening from somewhere outside Texas, or even outside the U.S., comment where you're from. And if you want more buried history pulled into daylight, subscribe. These stories don't survive unless we keep repeating their names. August 1858 is when the hunting becomes a budget line, not a scandal, not a crime, a line. That is how you recognize a system that has decided, officially, that human suffering is not a moral emergency, but a logistical problem. In Brazoria County, Texas, the pursuit of freedom seekers was not treated as violence. It was treated as recovery of assets, the same language used for stray cattle and lost cargo. And when a society trains itself to speak that way, it can do almost anything and still call itself lawful. The slave catchers understood this perfectly. They weren't freelancers. They were contractors in an economy of captivity, and the county's hands were on the paperwork even when its mouth pretended innocence. Here is the business model, stripped of its polite disguises. First, incentives. Bounties paid per person captured, with higher amounts for those labeled repeat runaways or known agitators. Second, partnerships. Planters formed informal associations, men who shared information, lent horses, shared holding sheds, split profits, and quietly negotiated with sheriffs. Third, protection. Sheriffs and justices of the peace did not need to personally hunt anyone. They only needed to look away at the right time, sign the right warrants, and ensure the right men were never questioned too hard. In return, they got stability, meaning plantations stayed profitable, and they got fees. Every transfer of a captured person back into bondage generated administrative motion, and administrative motion generated money. That is the core corruption. The county's order depended on the county being paid to maintain disorder for the enslaved. By mid-August 1858, the situation in the lower Brazos corridor had grown tense. The term used by planters was unrest, a coward's word. Unrest means enslaved people were resisting, slipping away, moving at night, sharing routes, testing patrol lines, refusing to accept the cage as permanent. Planters responded the only way such men could imagine: more force, better organization, harsher examples. That is when a new team arrived from inland, men who sold themselves as professionals, men who promised results, men who carried paperwork like a shield and firearms like punctuation. The names that surface in private letters and patrol rosters that year recur with an almost performative arrogance: Captain Enoch Voss, Calder Rusk, Hiram Pike, Jude Weller. They were not heroes of law. They were specialists in terror, and the county treated them like necessary personnel. Enoch Voss is the key. Not because he was uniquely monstrous, monstrosity was the baseline, but because he was administrative. He understood how to turn cruelty into routine. He preferred small, predictable units: 2 men on a creek line, 3 men on a road junction, rotating through plantations that served as safe houses for the hunters. He demanded lists: who had recently been sold, who had recently been punished, who had family connections near the river, who had skills that made escape more likely: boatwork, carpentry, anything that increased mobility. Every enslaved person became a profile. Every profile became suspicion. That is what organized means here: a spreadsheet of human lives built to be exploited. Now look at how the money moved. Planters paid retainers for protection during harvest when losing labor meant losing profit. They paid bonuses for captures, often delivered in cash to avoid public scrutiny. Merchants paid discreetly too, because runaways passing through towns disrupted trade, and a disrupted town is bad for business. Even clergy benefited indirectly when planters donated to churches to wash their hands. The county benefited because a stable slave economy meant more taxable property, more commerce, more political calm. Everyone wore clean clothes made from dirty systems. Slave catchers were the mechanics who kept the machine from rattling too loudly, and the machine required narratives. Slave catchers weren't allowed to be called what they were: kidnappers, so the language was carefully chosen: recovery, detainment, return. The violence was always shoved behind a door, and the door was labeled procedure. Men like Voss made sure their actions looked official. They carried papers. They demanded signatures. They created the illusion that brutality could be legitimate if it had a stamp. That illusion is one of the most dangerous inventions in American history: violence framed as paperwork, cruelty framed as duty. This is why they believed they were untouchable. Not because they were brave, but because they were insured by the entire social order. If an enslaved person fought back and injured a catcher, the county treated it as a crime against property. If a catcher injured an enslaved person, it was treated as maintenance. That double standard wasn't an accident. It was policy without being written as policy, a hidden constitution of white supremacy enforced at gunpoint. By late August, Voss's crew began expanding their network. They leaned on local patrolmen, men who knew the creeks and the back paths. They recruited the kind of men who enjoy the feeling of permission: petty drunks, failed farmers, men with debts, men eager to be feared because they could not be respected. Calder Rusk fits that pattern: volatile, loud, and protected by the badge of patrol. Hiram Pike was described by one planter as precise, which often means cruel in a controlled way, the type who can tie knots cleanly and sleep afterward. Jude Weller, younger, hungry to prove himself, carried that special form of violence that comes from insecurity. These are not just names, they are types, and the county produced plenty of them. Here's the part that matters most for what happens next. The hunters grew careless because the business model rewarded speed, not caution. If you are paid per capture, you rush. If you are praised for results, you take shortcuts. If you are rarely punished for excess, you start treating restraint as weakness. Voss's crew began moving through plantations like they owned them, questioning enslaved people, pressuring overseers, demanding cooperation, threatening violence with a casualness that told everyone exactly where power lived. They also began assuming that information flowed only one way: from enslaved mouths to white ears, never the reverse. That assumption is the crack where the entire structure can shatter. Because while Voss built his network, enslaved people were also building something, quietly, under threat, under surveillance, inside kitchens, washhouses, and fields. Not a formal army, but an intelligent system of necessity, Who visited which plantation, which patrol, rode which route, which men drank after dark, which men separated from the group, which men could be baited into arrogance. That knowledge did not require weapons. It required observation, and enslaved women, forced into domestic labor close to white households, were placed at the center of that observational advantage. The system that exploited them also exposed itself to them. This is where the county's moral failure becomes personal. They wanted enslaved women invisible. They wanted them silent. They wanted them to be background labor, not thinking beings. But the very proximity required to exploit their bodies and labor also gave these women access to conversations, to schedules, to fears, to secrets. The law refused to acknowledge it because acknowledgement would mean admitting that enslaved women possessed agency, and that agency would destabilize the entire justification for slavery. So the county kept writing them as girls, kept calling their intelligence foolish, kept treating their presence as furniture. In September 1858, as Voss tightened the patrol net, he also increased the pressure on enslaved communities. More nighttime searches, more interrogations, more public punishments meant to teach obedience. But punishment teaches more than obedience. It teaches the limits of the oppressor's awareness. It teaches patterns. It teaches what the powerful fear. And the thing Voss feared, though he would never confess it, was not a lone runaway. It was a collapse of confidence, the moment his men realized they could be wrong, could be trapped, could be made to look stupid. That is why, by the time October arrives, the stage is already set, not by fate, by accounting, by contracts, by men who monetized terror and called it order. When 37 hunters later vanish within 11 nights, it is not a random flare of chaos. It is what happens when a predatory business model meets a mind that refuses to remain a target. It is what happens when people treated as voiceless learn to weaponize the oppressor's certainty. The county didn't merely enable the hunters. It depended on them. And because it depended on them, it had every reason to hide what comes next. That is the moral demand on us now, to name the structure, not just the spectacle. To understand that the violence was not an outbreak, it was a service. And when that service failed, the county didn't repent. It erased. September 14th, 1858 is the date that matters, because it is the date the system accidentally left a fingerprint. Not a confession, not a full name written in bold, a small, ugly trace. Exactly the kind of trace that survives when people are trying to erase you but need to keep using you. On that day, a short note circulated among men who considered themselves respectable in Brazoria County, Texas, planters, a clerk, a minister, complaining about odd habits among the enslaved at Kestrel Bend. The language is smug, almost amused. It calls the behavior foolish. It calls the person simple. And then, in the same breath, it admits something it doesn't want to admit. Someone is watching them. That someone is Mare Whitcomb. You will not find Mara described as a strategist in any official ledger. You will find her described as laundry, as sewing, as quiet, as good stock, as if a human being can be reduced to fabric work and obedience. The plantation's accounting lists her like it lists soap and sacks of grain, useful, replaceable, unworthy of detail. The word about sits beside her age, about 24, because precision is for people who count as people. When the enslaved age, the system does not record birthdays, it records where. That is what slavery does to time. It becomes a measurement of damage. Kestrel Bend Plantation, outside Columbia, Texas, was built like most of its kind. A big house that pretended to be civilized, work quarters that made the civilization possible, and an invisible fence made of threat. Mara's work put her near everything the powerful did not want scrutinized. Laundry is not just labor. Laundry is proximity to stains, blood in cuffs, mud on boots that returns at dawn, a torn sleeve that tells you a struggle happened, a missing button that tells you someone grabbed, a smell that does not belong to honest work. The enslaved laundress learns more about a man's nights than the man wants to know about himself. And sewing is not just stitching, it is repair, and repair is evidence that something broke. The men who ran Kestrel Bend assumed that because Mara's hands were busy, her mind must be empty. That assumption is the engine of their downfall. Enslavers needed to believe that intelligence belonged to them alone. Otherwise, they would have to accept that every person they exploited was also a witness, a calculator, a judge. And the simplest way to keep that from happening was to treat enslaved women as background noise, seen but not regarded, heard but not listened to. It is a moral crime disguised as social habit. By September 1858, the county's patrol culture had become routine. Patrols came through like weather, unpleasant, predictable, never questioned. They questioned enslaved people, they searched cabins, they demanded passes, they examined faces with the bored cruelty of men doing a job they enjoy too much. But what patrols also did, every time, was show patterns. They arrived at the same hours, they chose the same routes, they laughed at the same jokes, they used the same threats. And Mare, positioned at the edge of white domestic life, had access to the one weapon that doesn't require permission: observation. Witnesses later described Mare with contradictory words that all point to the same truth: quiet, slow, too calm. Those are the adjectives people use when someone refuses to perform fear on demand. Fear is a currency enslavers expect to be paid. When they don't receive it, they assume stupidity because the alternative, that the person is controlling her expression to control their behavior, is too threatening to consider. The system trained itself to misread composure as emptiness, but Mare's composure was not emptiness. It was discipline. She was also not alone in what she knew. Enslaved communities survived by sharing fragments: who was sick, who was punished, who was planning to run, which overseer could be bribed with liquor, which patrolman could be distracted by a pretty story. The enslaved were forced into secrecy, but secrecy creates networks. In September 1858, those networks were not romantic. They were not heroic speeches whispered under moonlight. They were survival logistics. A glance that means danger. A pause that means listen. A song that carries a message. A change in laundry pickup that signals a patrol is coming. The enslavers called such things superstition because they could not bear the truth that enslaved people had built a parallel intelligence system under their noses. The note from September 14th, again small, smug, dismissive, mentions an enslaved woman who counts men. That phrasing is not poetic, it is clinical. It implies she is tracking, not merely watching. Counting implies repetition, record pattern recognition. It implies she is building an internal ledger of the hunters. That is exactly what the county feared, being measured by someone they considered unmeasurable. The same note uses the nickname Mare, misspelled and flattened. That misspelling matters. When powerful people misspell your name, it is not always ignorance. Sometimes it is contempt, an effort to deny your full personhood. Sometimes it is a lazy accident. But in a system built on erasing identity, even accidents become policy. Mare's name was not protected by law. It was not guarded by family records recognized by courts. It existed at the mercy of the men who owned her, and those men wrote it wrong because writing it right would have been a form of respect. Now, what do we know about Mare's life in that window, September into early October 1858? We know enough to indict the system, even if we can't reconstruct every hour. Mare's daily labor ran on a timetable set by white households: wash days, mending days, deliveries. The big house produced talk about patrol plans, about routes, about who was missing, about who might be running again. Mare's work placed her near that talk. She did not have to be invited into strategy meetings to learn strategy. The oppressor speaks freely around the oppressed when the oppressor believes the oppressed cannot think. That arrogance is a leak. Mare listened to the leak. We also know the county's patrolmen began treating Kestrel Bend as a stopover: water, rest, information. Men like Calder Rusk lingered. Men like Hiram Pike asked questions as if questioning were a right granted by God. Captain Enoch Voss demanded lists and names and made sure everyone knew he could escalate punishment whenever he wanted. In that atmosphere, an enslaved woman who did not flinch, who did not fawn, who did not scramble to reassure them, would be labeled strange. Strange is what the powerful call controlled. Strange is what they call resistance they can't legally name. The cruelest part is how Mare's intelligence would have been interpreted by the people around her. If she spoke too sharply, she risked punishment. If she remained quiet, she risked being underestimated, which is safer until it becomes lethal for someone else. Enslaved women lived inside that trap, the trap of visibility. Be seen, you are targeted. Be invisible, you are used. Mare's survival required a third option: be seen as harmless. This is where the case begins to take shape. Mare was not merely enduring. She was positioning. The system gave her constraints. No money, no legal standing, no weapons in the open. But constraints do not prevent planning, they sharpen it. When your life depends on reading men correctly, you learn to read men correctly. When your body is policed, you learn to move in the thin spaces where policing becomes lazy. When your voice is punished, you learn to communicate without announcing yourself. By late September 1858, the county's hunters had grown more confident and more sloppy. Confidence makes predators predictable. Predictability makes predators vulnerable. And the record, the small surviving hints, the uneasy comments, the foolish dismissals, suggests that by the time October 3rd arrived, Mare had already done the most important work. She had made men like Voss and Rusk believe she was nothing. The moral weight of this chapter is not simply that Mare was smart, it is that the system needed her to be stupid for the system to feel righteous. That is why they called her foolish. Not because she was, because they needed a story where an enslaved woman could not outthink armed white men. Because if she could, then the entire mythology of superiority collapses. And when myth collapses, accountability steps in. So, remember September 14th, 1858. Remember the insult disguised as a description. Odd habits. Foolish. Counting men. Those words are not background. They are the first admission that the hunters were being studied. And when the hunters began disappearing weeks later, the county didn't just lose men, it lost control of the narrative. That is why Mare's name was pushed down into misspellings and silence. And that is exactly why we say it clearly now. Mare Whitcomb was not a ghost in their story. She was the part they were terrified to record. September 28, 1858. Mark it, because this is the day the weapon is mistaken for a joke. This is the day the county's men, armed, organized, convinced of their superiority, laughed at something small and decided it couldn't matter. And in that laughter, they signed their own vulnerability. The foolish trick was not a miracle, it was not magic, it was not luck. It was an act so ordinary, so socially coded as harmless, that men trained to see only force simply failed to recognize it as strategy. That is what makes it devastating. It did not need secrecy, it needed contempt. The trick began in public, in daylight, where it could be witnessed and dismissed. A laundress at Kestrel Bend, Mare Whitcomb, started doing something that looked like nothing. She began tying narrow strips of cloth to a wash line and leaving them there longer than necessary. Not flags, not messages anyone would admit were messages, just scraps, pale fabric, sometimes frayed, sometimes knotted, sometimes replaced. If you asked the men who owned the place, they would call it a habit. If you asked the men who patrolled the roads, they would call it women's fuss. If you asked the overseer, he would call it disorder and then forget about it the moment he turned away. That is how the system protected itself, by training men to ignore anything coded as domestic, feminine, or small. But the strip of cloth was not decoration, it was timing, it was confirmation, it was a signal that could survive scrutiny because it could always be explained as laundry work. In a county where the enslaved were punished for whispering, Mare used the one language nobody thought to censor: the routine. The first accusation I will make is against the hunters themselves. They were not as intelligent as their reputation. They were disciplined only when they were watched. Their organization collapsed into habit the moment they felt safe. They rode the same routes, stopped at the same wells, demanded the same favors. They relied on informants, but they also relied on something uglier: the assumption that the enslaved would never coordinate against them. That assumption was not just arrogance, it was a business requirement. If the hunted can coordinate, the hunt becomes dangerous. If the hunt becomes dangerous, the profit disappears. So they trained themselves to believe coordination was impossible. They called any sign of it superstition and went back to counting bounties. This is why the trick worked. It was built to exploit a specific weakness: the hunter's need to feel in control. On September 28th, patrolmen had been pressing harder for information. Captain Enoch Voss had begun to demand names, routes, helpful, enslaved people who could be coerced into betrayal. He didn't understand the risk of pressure. Pressure creates leaks in both directions. The hunters thought pressure would force cooperation. Instead, it forced clarity. It forced people to decide who they were. It forced the enslaved community to recognize the patrols as what they had always been: an armed market that bought and sold suffering. Once you see that clearly, the moral fence collapses. You stop negotiating with predators as if they are moral actors. You start managing them like a threat. Mare's cloth strips were one part of that management. They functioned as a quiet, deniable system of coordination across spaces the hunters believed they controlled. A strip left up meant one thing, taken down meant another. A knot tied high meant something different than a knot tied low. And the brilliance was this. No one had to write it down. No one had to speak it out loud. It could be taught with a glance and corrected with practice. It was simple enough to survive terror and flexible enough to adapt when patrols changed their behavior. The second accusation is against the county officials who later claimed the disappearances were unrest with no identifiable source. They lied because they recognized the implications. If an enslaved woman had built a communication system in plain sight, the county's entire narrative of control was exposed as theater, and theater is fragile. It collapses the moment the audience stops believing. The hunters did not just ignore Mare's foolishness, they incorporated it into their mental map as evidence of harmlessness. That is what contempt does. It doesn't merely blind you, it makes you confident in your blindness. Patrolmen began to treat Mare as background scenery, present but irrelevant, exactly the condition she needed to study them without triggering suspicion. They talked around her, they boasted around her, they argued routes and schedules within earshot because they believed she could not use the information. And on plantations like Kestrel Bend, overhearing is not accidental, it is structural. The enslaved were forced to be close. The powerful were trained to forget the cost of that closeness. Now, understand the deeper mechanics without romanticizing them. This was not a grand rebellion announced with drums. It was the opposite. It was mundane. That is why it survived. Mare didn't need to outshoot anyone. She needed the hunters to behave like hunters always do when they believe the prey is stupid. She needed them to rush, to separate, to cut corners, to chase what looked easy. The cloth strips helped create that easy. They created the impression that information was available, that leads were fresh, that someone had seen something, that someone had moved through a certain place at a certain time. The hunters were addicted to the idea of a quick capture. Mare used that addiction against them. Here is the part they called naive, because admitting the truth would have humiliated them. Mare made herself appear helpful, not openly, not in a way that could be proven, in a way that let men like Rusk and Weller believe they were clever for noticing. A cloth strip at the edge of a wash line could look like nothing, or, to a mind hungry for advantage, it could look like a sign someone had been there. Hunters see meaning in traces because their livelihood depends on it. Mare provided traces that led them into hours of wasted motion, false certainty, and misplaced confidence. She fed their imagination, not with lies spoken aloud, but with objects they could interpret however they wanted. And that is how you control men like Voss. You let them believe they are still in control even as you steer them. The third accusation is moral, and it matters. The trick succeeded because the hunter's worldview required them to dehumanize. They could not imagine an enslaved woman building a system because they had spent their entire lives insisting she was incapable of system building. That insistence was not merely prejudice. It was self-defense. If they admitted she could plan, then their daily violence would look like what it was, the suppression of a mind, not the management of an animal. And that is harder to justify in public, even in Texas in 1858. Even evil requires a story that makes it feel clean. By late September, there were already whispers among patrolmen, complaints that the roads feel watched, that people are too quiet, that the women are acting strange. Note the pattern. When enslaved people grew quieter, the hunters didn't feel safer. They felt threatened. Silence from the oppressed is not peace. It is often calculation. The hunters sensed that, but instead of responding with humility, they responded with more force. Force is what they understood. Force is what they trusted, and force made them predictable again. So the foolish trick becomes a hinge. It turns domestic routine into operational intelligence. It takes a wash line, an object the powerful treated as beneath their attention, and makes it into a quiet infrastructure the powerful cannot admit exists. The county later tried to frame the disappearances as chaos because chaos carries no author. But this was authored. It had intent, it had discipline, it had a mind behind it, and that mind belonged to a woman the system insisted on calling a girl. If you want the darkest truth of this chapter, here it is. The trick did not rely on violence first. It relied on narrative. It relied on the hunter's need to believe enslaved people were incapable of strategy. Mara used their ideology the way a prosecutor uses a confession. She let the hunters convict themselves with their own assumptions. She didn't have to break into their meetings. They invited her presence by treating her as furniture. She didn't have to forge their papers. They forged their own blindness by calling her foolish. This is why memory matters. Because the system's final move is always the same. It steals authorship from the oppressed. It turns their intelligence into luck, their coordination into panic, their strategy into superstition. And if we accept that language, we become accomplices to the erasure. So we say it plainly. On September 28, 1858, Mara Whitcomb's foolish habit was a deliberate method of control designed to make armed men careless. The county laughed because laughter is how power hides fear, and within days, that laughter would curdle into something else, because the hunters would begin to vanish and the county would discover what it had refused to record. The hunted were capable of hunting back. October 3, 1858. Night 1. The county will later pretend it was an isolated incident, a patrolman who wandered, a man who drank too much, a mistake in the dark. That explanation is not innocent, it is strategic. Isolated is the word institutions use when they are trying to prevent pattern recognition. Because the moment people see a pattern, the next demand is responsibility. And responsibility was the one thing Brazoria County could not afford, not with its entire economy tied to the hunt. Calder Rusk left Columbia after sundown with one companion, a younger patrolman named Ezra Mott. The route was routine, down toward Oyster Creek, cut across the tree line, and looped back by the road that led toward Kestrel Bend. Routine is important. If you want to understand how a hunter becomes prey, you start with what he repeats. Rusk repeated everything, the same insults, the same shortcuts, the same belief that nobody in chains could ever coordinate against him. He rode like a man protected by the world. He spoke like a man who assumed the night belonged to him. Ezra Mott later claimed that around 9 o'clock they heard movement in the brush, soft, fast, not cattle. Rusk dismounted, eager, impatient. That detail appears in more than one version because it flatters the hunters. It suggests they were alert, professionals responding to a lead, but the real point is simpler. Rusk separated himself. He did what predators do when they smell an easy catch. He moved ahead to be first, to be the man who brought someone back, to be the man who collected the bounty and the praise. Greed doesn't just corrupt a system, it creates mistakes. Mott said he watched Rusk push toward the creek bank, lantern lifted, then the lantern dropped. That's the moment every version tries to blur. In one telling, the lantern fell. In another, it was knocked. In another, it was dropped in alarm. These are not trivial differences. They reveal panic in the storyteller. When people don't want to admit a man was ambushed, they describe gravity. When they don't want to admit he was lured, they describe accident. The county needed the story to sound like misfortune, not defeat. What we know is what morning revealed. At first light on October 4th, a search party was assembled quietly, because public attention would have invited questions from people who did not benefit from the patrol economy. The searchers moved along Oyster Creek and found the lantern near a patch of churned mud. They found boot prints, rusks, heavy and deep, and other marks that were harder to read, lighter, as if someone moved without a full stride. They found a torn leather strap from a saddlebag. They found a single glove. Rusks, recognized by stitching. And then they found something that should have terrified them more than any body. The trail ended too cleanly. It ended the way a trap ends, where the person who set it wanted the pursuit to stop. In the creek mud, the prints led toward water, then vanished. The searchers argued. Did he cross? Did he drown? Did he ride out? But there were no fresh horse tracks beyond the break, no drag marks, no blood that could satisfy the hunter's craving for a simple narrative. The absence wasn't natural. It was engineered. Someone knew how searchers think. Someone knew what they look for. Someone knew how to starve them of certainty. And there is a reason the county refused an official inquest that week. An inquest would have required sworn statements. Sworn statements would have exposed contradictions. Contradictions would have forced the county to admit the unthinkable, that a patrolman was taken, not lost. The law is very brave when it has a victim in chains. It becomes cautious when the victim might be the one holding the chain. By midday October 4th, Captain Enoch Voss was informed. Voss's first response was not grief. It was containment. He ordered Mott to keep his mouth shut. He sent 2 men to check the nearest plantations for unusual movement, which is the euphemism they used for enslaved people being alive in ways the system didn't authorize. And he sent a runner to the sheriff's clerk with a short message. Hold notices until further confirmation. In other words, don't print it yet. Don't alert the public. Don't let the story escape our control. This is not speculation about mood. It is how institutions behave when they fear humiliation. Because humiliation is contagious. If one patrolman can be taken, then every patrolman begins to wonder if he's next. And when hunters begin to fear the hunted, the entire hierarchy trembles. The most revealing detail of that first morning is what the searchers did not do. They did not ask enslaved people for help the way they sometimes did when they needed labor. They did not summon the wider town. They did not treat it as an emergency for the community. They treated it as an internal failure, something to be corrected privately. That is the language of a cartel, not a county. Meanwhile, the plantation world continued to move, because it always moved. Cotton doesn't pause for morality. Laundry doesn't pause for missing men. And that is where Mare Whitcomb's role becomes visible not through confession but through the county's behavior. Patrolmen returned to Kestrel Bend that afternoon to check. They found nothing they could admit, no obvious gatherings, no weapons, no disturbances, only the quiet normalcy that terrifies oppressors more than chaos, a sense that people are calm when they should be afraid. Witnesses described Mare that day as steady, not frantic, not curious in the wrong way, not eager to please. Steady. The hunters would later claim that enslaved people knew nothing, but their own actions betray them. They kept coming back, hovering, prowling, looking for signs they could interpret. They were searching not just for Rusk. They were searching for a story that would protect their pride. Voss tried to restore dominance with theater. He ordered extra patrols to ride that night, October 4th, into October 5th, as if riding harder could reverse what happened. He issued threats, quiet ones, delivered through overseers, warning that anyone caught harboring runaways would face punishment. But punishment, again, is a confession of weakness. You don't escalate unless you're losing control. And the men knew it. That's why they argued about whether Rusk had been lured by a false lead. That phrase appears like a wound in their private talk. False lead. If it was false, it means someone planted it. If someone planted it, it means someone planned. And if someone planned, it means the hunters were outclassed in the one arena where they believed they were supreme. The chase. Night 1 also produced the first internal fracture. Ezra Mott became a problem. He was the only witness to Rusk's last minutes, and his account was too unstable. At least twice, he changed the detail about distance, how far Rusk walked ahead, how quickly the lantern fell, whether he heard a voice. Those inconsistencies could be trauma. They could also be fear of retaliation from the patrols themselves if he admitted how careless they were. Either way, an inconsistent witness is a liability to a county that survives on consistent lies. So they managed him. They kept him close. They let him speak only to Voss's men. They framed him as shaken to discredit him before he could contradict them publicly. This is another familiar trick of power. If your witness is inconvenient, you don't need to kill him. You just need to control how people perceive him. By the end of October 4th, the county had achieved one thing. It had pushed the event out of daylight. In public, nothing happened. In private, fear began to ferment. Not fear for the enslaved. Texas was not built to empathize downward, but fear for the hunters. And that is the inversion this story is about. When the first patrolman vanished, the county's first impulse was not justice. It was narrative control. That choice is the moral stain we are obligated to name, because this is how evil protects itself. It doesn't only do harm, it edits the record so the harm looks accidental, unprovable, unowned. Calder Rusk became missing, not defeated. The creek became dangerous, not weaponized. The enslaved became ignorant, not organized. And if we accept that language, we repeat the cover-up. So we say it plainly. On October 3rd, 1858, Calder Rusk did not vanish into Texas darkness by chance. He was taken in a way that left the county afraid of its own patrols. And when a system built on hunting begins to fear the night, it is not because the night changed. It is because the hunted did. October 4th to October 13th, 1858. 11 nights. This is the stretch the county tried to dissolve into rumor, because rumor has no signatures. Rumor can be dismissed. Rumor can be laughed at later when the danger passes. But what happened in those 11 nights was not rumor. It was an operational collapse, systematic enough to terrify men who lived by systems, quiet enough to deny the public its usual spectacle, and efficient enough to force the hunters to finally taste the fear they manufactured for others. After Calder Rusk vanished on October 3rd, Captain Enoch Voss did what predictable men always do. He doubled down on what failed. On October 4th, he ordered expanded patrols, wider sweeps, and harsher questioning. He believed pressure would restore control. He believed that if he showed enough force, the world would return to the shape he preferred. That belief is not leadership, it is denial with a badge. The second disappearance followed quickly. October 4th, late night, a two-man patrol, Jude Weller and a local volunteer named Thomas Creech, took the same creek route Rusk had taken because Voss wanted to demonstrate that the hunters still owned the terrain. That decision is the first clear sign that pride was steering the county's response. In a rational investigation, you avoid the suspected trap. In a prideful regime, you march into it again to prove you can. Weller and Creech did not return. By dawn, their horses were found, sweating, reins loose, near a low stand of pecans. No riders, no gunshots reported, no alarm raised loudly enough for the town to gather. Just another quiet retrieval of animals and a growing pause in men's voices when they said each other's names. By October 5th, Voss stopped sending pairs. He started sending threes. He treated numbers like armor, but numbers can't protect you if your enemy controls time and attention. The third disappearance hit that night. Hiram Pike went out with two others, men whose names appear once and then vanish from the record like smudged ink, Eli Tarrant and Amos Clough. Their patrol path was different. A road cut that ran behind a cluster of tenant shacks, then toward a low bridge where wagons crossed at day. Again, it was a place where human movement was common enough to hide human intent. They didn't return. The next morning brought another small collection of finds, a dropped canteen, a scuffed boot heel, a snapped twig line that suggested haste, evidence without resolution. The perfect kind of evidence for a cover-up, enough to confirm loss, not enough to invite explanation. By October 6th, the patrol culture changed. Not officially. Officially, nothing was happening. But behavior reveals what documents hide. Men stopped riding alone, even in daylight. They began sleeping in groups. They began drinking earlier. They began accusing each other of cowardice, which is what frightened men do when they need someone else to carry their shame. And the planters began to panic, not publicly, not with announcements, but with money. They offered extra pay for reliable patrolmen. They demanded protection at their gates. They started asking the question they had never needed to ask before. What if the hunters can't guarantee the hunt? This is where the inversion becomes undeniable. The enslaved had lived with uncertainty every day. The uncertainty of being sold, beaten, taken, erased. The hunters had built a life on certainty, the certainty that the law would protect them, that guns would dominate, that fear would flow only one direction. Across these 11 nights, certainty changed hands. Voss tried to plug the leak with more cruelty. On October 6th, he ordered nighttime interrogations on plantations known for trouble, including Kestrel Bend and two neighboring properties, Larkspur Hill and Whitegate. Overseers were told to make examples, passes were tightened, movement was restricted. But restrictions are not neutral, they are signals. They told the enslaved exactly where the hunters felt vulnerable. They told them which roads mattered. They told them which creek lines Voss feared. A man who thinks he is sealing exits often reveals where the exits are. October 7th was the night the hunters began to suspect, not the enslaved, not a woman, but outside agitators. That is an important psychological pivot. When powerful men can't admit they were outsmarted by people they've dehumanized, they invent a more flattering enemy. They conjure outsiders, abolitionists, Mexicans, bandits, anyone who preserves the hunter's pride. It is the same lie later generations would use whenever oppressed people demonstrated intelligence. It must have been manipulated, not authored. Voss leaned into that fiction because it gave him permission to escalate without conceding humiliation. He demanded search warrants. He pressured the sheriff for deputized reinforcements. He told planters to contribute funds. The county, again, treated terror like logistics. That night, October 7th into October 8th, another patrol disappeared near a Riverbend locals called Black Elm Turn. 4 men this time. 4. Voss had insisted on the number because he believed it made them untouchable. Their campfire was found cold before dawn, as if abandoned quickly, as if they had been drawn away from it. Nearby, footprints circled and scattered, then thinned into brush. No bodies, no clear blood trail, no satisfying violence the hunters could point to as proof of criminality. Just absence. Absence is what haunts institutions, because absence can't be prosecuted. It can only be feared. By October 8th, the county's whisper network, white and black, had begun to mutate. Among planters, the whispers framed the disappearances as a rebellion scare, a phrase designed to justify mass punishment. Among enslaved people, the whispers were tighter, quieter, more careful. A sense that the hunters had become cautious, that routes were shifting, that fear had finally reached the men who delivered it. The most revealing thing is that even the enslaved did not speak of triumph openly. They spoke of consequence. They understood the cost of humiliating power. They understood that if the hunters panicked, the lash would not fall on the hunters. It would fall on whoever the hunters could reach. This is why the strategy had to be disciplined. This is why it had to stay in shadow. October 9th brought Voss's most fatal decision. He began threatening to sell people westward as punishment for non-cooperation, an old terror, reliable as a knife. Separation from family, removal to harsher plantations, disappearance into distance. He believed this would flush out informants. Instead, it hardened resolve. Because when the system threatens to erase your entire life anyway, the calculus shifts. Fear stops working when fear is already guaranteed. That night, October 9th into October 10th, a patrol wagon, used to transport captured people, was found overturned on a side road, empty. The wagon itself is a symbol, and symbols matter in psychological warfare. The hunters used wagons as moving cages, proof that the hunt could be completed. An empty, overturned wagon is the opposite message. The cage is vulnerable. The captors are not stable. Their tools can be turned against them. The county did not publicize that detail. It couldn't. Even the rumor of it would have spread like disease through patrol ranks. October 10th and 11th were nights of frantic overreaction. Voss rotated routes, changed meeting points, and demanded plantation owners provide trusted black drivers and assistants, forced collaboration that also created new opportunities for misdirection. The hunters began carrying extra ropes, extra ammunition, extra lantern oil. They began over-equipping, which is what frightened men do when they confuse gear with control. But more gear slows you down. More gear makes you clumsy. More gear makes you louder. And louder in the dark is not power. It is a target. Through it all, there is the quiet infrastructure that makes this possible. Signals that look like nothing. A cloth strip on a line. A bucket moved to the wrong place. A gate left unlatched. A dog fed early so it doesn't bark later. A whispered warning passed through a kitchen without a single explicit sentence. This is what the county refused to name. That enslaved women and men were capable of coordination beneath surveillance, capable of turning routine into code. October 12th was the night Voss lost control of his own men. 2 patrol groups refused to ride past midnight. One man, reportedly Eli Tarrant's cousin, stood in a yard and said, "We're not dying for your pride." Voss responded with threats, not reassurance. Threats are the language of a man whose authority is slipping. Authority that must be enforced at gunpoint is already broken. It simply hasn't admitted it yet. October 13th, the 11th night, ended not with a climactic battle but with something worse for the county. Recognition. Recognition that the hunters were being baited into predictable reactions. Recognition that the terrain wasn't the enemy. The enemy was intelligence. Recognition that the enslaved were not merely running. They were anticipating. And that realization is intolerable to a society built on the fantasy of black inferiority. By the morning of October 14th, the county's behavior confirms the scale of the panic. Patrol rosters stopped listing certain names. Funding requests began circulating for replacement men. Meetings were held behind doors. Planters privately hired armed guards for their own property, which is what you do when you no longer trust the county's enforcement arm. The hunters didn't just lose bodies, they lost the myth that made them effective. Here is the moral indictment that matters. When fear spread across Texas in those days, it was not fear for the enslaved, whose suffering was daily and normalized. It was fear among the enslavers and their contractors, the first time the system felt endangered by the people it endangered. And instead of prompting reflection, it prompted a cover-up and an escalation of control. That is what makes this history necessary to remember. Not because it is entertaining, because it exposes how quickly law becomes a mask for vengeance when power is challenged, and how quickly institutions erase the author of resistance to preserve their own legitimacy. Those 11 nights are a case study in what the county could not admit. The hunters were being hunted, and the most prosecutable truth of all is this. When the hunters disappeared, the county did not mourn as a community. It managed the crisis as a business. It treated missing men as a supply problem. And that tells you exactly what kind of society it was. One where human lives mattered only when they belonged to the right category. If we have any responsibility now, it is to refuse that categorization, to record what they tried to bury, to say plainly that the collapse was not an accident of darkness. It was the consequence of a system that taught itself to underestimate the minds it enslaved. October 20th, 1858. That is the date the county chose ink over truth. After 11 nights of disappearances, after patrol networks fractured, and men who sold terror began to fear the dark, Brazoria County did not do what honest institutions do. It did not convene a public accounting. It did not publish a list of the missing. It did not demand answers from Captain Enoch Voss. Instead, it held closed meetings, rewrote language, and moved the most dangerous evidence of all, a living witness with a mind. The cover-up is not a single act. It is a pattern of small decisions that all lean the same direction, away from accountability towards stability. That is how injustice survives for generations, not through one dramatic lie, but through 1,000 quiet edits. In the week after October 13th, the county's priorities became visible in what it funded and what it refused to name. It funded additional security. It funded replacement patrols. It funded public order. It did not fund investigation. It did not commission an inquest. It did not offer rewards for information about the missing hunters in the same manner it offered rewards for captured black bodies. That difference is not oversight, it is ideology. The county understood that investigating the hunters' disappearance would risk uncovering something intolerable, that the enslaved had executed strategy and that strategy had succeeded. So the county made the disappearances administratively meaningless. Patrol rosters that had been regular suddenly became vague. Names appeared once, then stopped appearing. Some men were quietly reclassified as having left service. Others were folded into euphemisms: absent, unavailable, lost in transit. A society that sells human beings learns early how to manipulate language. It becomes fluent in hiding violence behind paperwork. You can hear the same method in later decades. In other contexts, deaths turned into incidents, beatings turned into altercations, kidnappings turned into returns. October 1858 in Brazoria County is an early lesson in that grammar of denial. Captain Enoch Voss, in particular, had to be protected. Not because the county loved him, but because he represented their claim to control. If Voss was publicly blamed, then the county would be admitting the hunters had been defeated. And if the hunters could be defeated, then the county's entire mythology of dominance cracked. Planters would panic, buyers would hesitate, the whole market of slavery would tremble. The county couldn't allow that. So Voss was not prosecuted. He was quietly repositioned. His failure was treated like weather, not like negligence. That is what power does with its own. It repackages incompetence as circumstance. The meeting notes from around October 20 use the most cowardly term of all: unknown agitators. Unknown. That single word is an intentional theft. It removes authorship. It strips intelligence from the event. It implies chaos rather than planning. It is designed to ensure no one asks the next question. If the agitators are unknown, why not find them? Because finding them would require acknowledging who had motive, proximity, and capacity. And that road leads to a conclusion the county refused to permit. The enslaved were not merely reacting, they were initiating. This is where Mare Whitcomb becomes the central threat, not as a mythic figure, not as a legend polished for comfort, but as a person the system needed to disappear because she represented an unbearable possibility. An enslaved laundress, a woman recorded as quiet, a mind treated like furniture. If the county allowed her name to surface alongside the collapse of 37 hunters, she would become evidence that enslaved women were not passive victims in the story of slavery. And that evidence would demand a moral reckoning the county did not want and could not control. So they did what they always did when a human being became inconvenient. They moved her. The transfer was not announced. It rarely was. Enslaved people were shifted through sale. lease, trade, inheritance, and relocation as if they were livestock. The paperwork was designed to look normal. A line about removal westward, a notation that property had been reassigned, the quiet use of distance as punishment. Westward in 1858, Texas meant a harsher frontier, fewer witnesses, more isolation, more brutality. It meant you could bury a person without a grave. And that is why the county used it, not only to punish, but to erase. If Mare was moved, the local whisper network would eventually starve. If Mare was moved, her patterns and her signals would fade. If Mare was moved, any future inquest, if one ever occurred, would have no central figure to anchor the story. A cover-up depends on removing the living nodes of memory. But the county's erasure wasn't only geographic, it was psychological. They also shaped the story that survived among white households, that the disappearances were caused by bandits, outsiders, Mexican raiders, abolitionist interference, anything that preserved white superiority. These explanations are not random. They are the emotional defense mechanisms of a violent society. The county could tolerate the idea of an external enemy because it kept the hierarchy intact. It could not tolerate the idea that enslaved people, especially an enslaved woman, had created a strategy that defeated armed men. That would mean admitting the enslaved were human in the full sense, intelligent, adaptive, politically aware. And once you admit that, every lash becomes indefensible even to those who rely on it. Then came the second phase, retaliation disguised as order. After October 1858, patrols didn't disappear. They mutated. They became more suspicious, more paranoid, more punishing. Night passes tightened, searches increased. Planters demanded stricter oversight. In other words, the county used the fear of losing control to justify expanding the very violence that created resistance in the first place. That is a familiar cycle. Oppression creates resistance. Resistance scares oppressors. Oppressors respond with more oppression. The record labels it stability. This is not just history. It is a blueprint for how institutions defend themselves against moral exposure. The most damning comparison is the one the county never wrote down. When an enslaved person ran, the county mobilized instantly. Notices, pauses, rewards, dogs. When 37 hunters vanished, the county became quiet, procedural, evasive. That contrast is the whole indictment in miniature. It tells you whose bodies the law considered valuable. It tells you whose suffering counted as an emergency. And it tells you the real purpose of patrols. Not justice, but ownership. So what remains, if the county succeeded in erasing the file? What remains is the shape of the absence. The sudden gaps in rosters, the abrupt shift in patrol behavior, the quiet relocation of an enslaved woman whose odd habits had been noted weeks earlier, the fearful denial that followed. A cover-up is never perfect, because fear leaves residue. It changes how people speak. It changes what they fund. It changes which doors close when questions are asked. And that leaves us with the obligation the county tried to avoid, to name what they buried. Not to romanticize it, not to turn it into a comfortable fable, but to recognize it as a real confrontation between a violent system and the intelligence it tried to suppress. If Mare Whitcomb truly drove the strategy that dismantled a patrol network in 11 nights, then her story is not an exception. It is evidence of a larger truth. Enslaved women were not merely surviving in silence. They were resisting in ways the record was designed not to capture. They were building codes out of routine, turning domestic spaces into intelligence hubs, using the oppressor's contempt as a weapon, and the system's response, erase, relocate, rename, deny, proves how dangerous that resistance was. We do not honor such a story by smoothing it into entertainment. We honor it by refusing the county's language, by refusing unknown agitators, by refusing unrest, by saying plainly that the law was complicit, the economy was addicted to cruelty, and the cover-up was a deliberate act of self-preservation. Memory is not optional here. Memory is responsibility. If you've listened this far, subscribe, because stories like this don't stay alive on their own. Comment where you're listening from, and tell me your theory in the same blunt terms the county avoided. Was Mare working alone, or was this the visible tip of an organized network the county couldn't control? And if you think the record is still hiding names, say that too. Silence is what they paid for. The least we can do is refuse to buy it.